So my talk is called Dark Reveals the Light, and I have taken that from a song that has been specially written for us for this year's theme of Dance of Life and Death by the wonderful Helen Yeomans, who's doing workshops here and teaching that song. And the lyrics, she teamed up with Chris Paradox, wonderful performance poet, and he wrote the lyrics. So the full lyrics are, death gives meaning to life, just as dark reveals the light. And then there's a mantra after that, Om Vajrasattva Hung. Death gives meaning to life, just as dark reveals the light. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between death and preciousness of life, and try and relate that back to the Buddha's basic teachings around suffering, his most basic teachings around suffering or dukkha. Also relate it to the Buddhist teachings around emptiness that Sarah mentioned. And I also want to talk more personally about my own experience of my parents dying and how that gave birth to a project called Tara Sanctuary and Natural Burial Ground. So that's quite a lot. We'll see what emerges out of conditions. But I want to start with a story, a little story. And this was a conversation that I heard on a London bus a few years ago between a little boy, who I think was about 5 years old, and his dad. And he had questions about death that he was putting to his dad. He, I think, didn't quite understand yet how to grammatically pose a question. So he sort of posed them as statements, but clearly, as you'll hear, they were questions. And I was so struck by the conversation that I wrote the whole thing down. And he said, Daddy, when a car squishes you, you die. And his dad's response was, that's not very nice. So that response clearly did not cut it for this young person. And he said it again in a different way. Daddy, when you're squished by a car, you die. And this time his dad's response was, that's true, but it's not very nice. Next question was, Daddy, when you die, what happens up in the air? So I presume this was something he'd heard about heaven, angels, something along those lines. The response was, what do you mean? I don't understand what you mean. When you die, you're dead. That's it. Then it got a lot more tricky. Daddy, Mummy's not going to die. So the response was, no, you die when you're very old, and we have lots of time and lots of things to do. So I couldn't help wondering how it would be when he finds out that that's not true. That people do not always die when they're very old. It seemed to me that conversation just really, really summed up something, but what's going to be talked about a lot here. You know, our culture's predominant orientation towards death. Not very nice. Not very nice to ask questions about, to mention. And that is something that's changing. It's changing. You know, this festival here is in the context of a shift in our culture, I think. Where there is the natural death movement, there's the hospice movement, there's natural burial grounds, there's death cafes where you can go and eat cake, drink tea and talk about death. There's a recognition of this need to turn towards death that's been so much part of the Buddhist tradition. That's coming more widely into the culture. So this duality, this kind of death, not very nice. Life, nice. Life, good. Death, bad. This duality, this kind of splitting. I want to relate this now to the Buddha's teachings on dukkha. So the Buddha is saying that there's experience unfolding, and our tendency is to push away what we don't want, what we think of as not very nice, or we don't want it, and try and reel in what we think of as nice and what's going to give us pleasure. And in that movement, that push and pull, that's where we really start to suffer. That's the basic teaching, which I'm sure many people will be really familiar with. And kind of wrapped up in that push and pull, there's always this kind of duality. There's some kind of duality. So there's something we're wanting to reel in, and there's something we're not wanting. So, examples would be, correct, incorrect, don't want the incorrect, want the correct. Boring, exciting. Noisy or quiet. This is one I've been working with a little bit with issues around location and noise clash and so on. Noisy. Of course, noise is sound that we don't like, isn't it? It's not just any old sound. So noisy, quiet. We want to move towards the one and push away the other. And the stronger that kind of splitting, and the stronger the pushing and the pulling, the more the dukkha, the more the suffering. Dukkha is this word in Buddhism for suffering or unsatisfactoriness that we create out of this push and pull. So if we look more closely at this kind of duality, this splitting, this preferencing, we see that it's a mind-created thing. And if we look at some dualities, it's completely obvious that it's absurd to preference the one and push away the other. So if we think about left and right, for example, left does not exist without right. Those two things are relational. It would be absurd to say, no, I want left, no right, I only want left. That does not make sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. But with other dualities, it's less obvious that is still what's going on. That the two things which are in relationship to each other, which can't really be divided. So if we think about me and you, sense of me only arises in relation to what is not me. So that's a you, an other, or an object which is an other. It doesn't make sense without that. Suffering and freedom. So we want the freedom, we don't want the suffering. But how would we have any sense of freedom without suffering? So freedom is freedom from suffering, isn't it? How could we get in touch with a longing for freedom if we didn't know suffering? Suffering is the kind of compost for that longing for freedom for ourselves and for others. It doesn't make any sense to split those. And death and life. Death and life is the same thing. We want to preference the one and not have the other, but it's an indivisible whole. So if we cut ourselves off from the one, we negate the one, we suppress the one. Actually, because it's an indivisible whole, we end up suppressing the whole thing. So the way I heard this put is that to deny grief is life denying. We cut ourselves off from life, from our energy, from our love. So to relate this to emptiness, so these things are in relationship. Everything is relational. That's another way of talking about this teaching of emptiness. Everything is relational. It makes no sense to separate things off. They don't exist separately from everything else that they arise together with. It makes no sense to do that. So maybe some of that sounds a little bit abstract. I'd like to talk a little bit more personally now of my own experience of death giving meaning to life, death connecting with the preciousness of life. And I'm going to talk about my parents and their death. And my dad died in 2012, and then my mum died about a year and a half after that in 2014. And quite a few years before my mum died, she gradually got more and more ill, declined over quite a long period, and I had an experience on a retreat where it came to me very clearly that she was going to die at some point, and I hadn't really gone there. That hadn't become vivid to me until that point, and I just cried a lot. I sobbed for quite a long time, and then the question arose in my mind, is there something underneath that grief? And I kind of dropped down into my being, and then I felt that I touched into this seam that was underneath that was much more still and bittersweet and was really just the nature of love. So going through that grief, allowing it not suppressing it, I touched into how much I loved my mother. And she was a wonderful woman. My dad used to describe her as pure-hearted. And then I found, when I came to Buddhism, that word is one of the adjectives used to describe the Buddha, the pure-hearted one. So, yes, then when it came to caring for my mum, we were very, very lucky. Myself, my brother, my sister-in-law. We had about a year where we really, it kept looking as if my mum was going to die, and then she would pull through. So that gave us the huge gift of a year where we were really aware of her coming death, and we could really sort of cherish her. And we spent some fantastic time. I feel very lucky for how that unfolded. So we were so sensitive to her and her beauty, and because of knowing that this was it, there wasn't so much time. When it came to my dad, he died. He'd just had a terminal diagnosis a week before, and then he died suddenly. So there was also the shock, and I'm sure a number of people know what that combo of grief and shock is like, as an added layer. And in those kind of hours and days after he died, I found myself hyper sensitive, like the skin's been torn off, and everything trivial things didn't matter. I'm sure this is familiar. How people were with me and my brother around it, the funeral directors, people in the hospice, people when we went to register the death, it mattered so much. When people were really clocked, took me in properly, when people were bureaucratic, and it was so painful. And I realised how much that all matters. And this was really what gave birth to this, wanting to do this project, the Natural Burial Ground project, Tara Sanctuary and Natural Burial Ground. So when we came to bury my mum and dad, I won't go into all the details of why, but where they ended up being buried is not that lovely. And I felt sad. It's not somewhere I want to go and visit. And I thought how wonderful it would be to have somewhere that was exquisitely beautiful, to go and visit a grave of a loved one. And a place where you can really want to dwell and meditate and reflect. A place like, as in the Buddhist tradition, it's recommended to reflect on death. And so this was part of what brought into being this project, which we've set up as a charity. We haven't found the land yet, but we will do, near Bristol. So yes, this seeing that how death really connects. In my mum's funeral, I found myself experiencing joy because there was so much love there, so much love for her, and that was so connecting. And so I could see how connecting death can be at best. And then my experience with Buddhafield has been that land is very connecting. So when Buddhafield started to buy some pieces of land for retreats, I felt like things deepened, the sense of community deepened through that kind of connecting with the land, caring for the land. There was connection from that. So I thought that the combination of the connecting power of death and the connecting power of land to create connection and community could be very, very strong. And I recently learnt that in the pagan tradition, the worship of land and the worship of ancestors are kind of linked together, because there's this feeling of you bury the ancestors and then they become the land. So you revere the land, because that's your ancestors in there. So I thought that's kind of part of what we're doing in a way. So a place vision is, there's the whole team of us now. There's Annie there, others, local band who's been involved with Looking for the Land. Yes, a place where we can really give to people who are in that vulnerable, skin torn off state of grief, and help have a place of beauty, and a place in nature that helps to hold people in that grief. Helps to bring the big perspective, and a place that is creating new life. So Natural Burial Grounds usually they're creating new habitat. That might be wildflower meadow or new woodland, or we're thinking about woodland pasture, which is a kind of combination of those two, very species rich. Biodiversity, you're kind of creating nourishing life through death, and a place to have beautiful little retreats to really honour people, a place for there to be time, really spacious time, not like in a crematorium where you've got your half an hour slot or your hour slot, which feels like so brutal. You can do the whole thing there. The idea is to have ceremonies under canvas, low impact, low carbon footprint. Yes, and we'll see how it unfolds, but that is the vision, and it's very much grown from my own experience, and others who've also had that experience of how death can wake you up, and how it can connect us with what really matters. Yeah.